What can we learn from other clinical settings on the influence of the gut microbiome on the brain? By Eamon M. Quigley. From the gut-brain axis to the microbiota gut-brain axis. The concept of the brain-gut axis, a bidirectional channel of communication between the big brain in the cranium and the little brain, that is, the enteric nervous system in the abdomen, linked by neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, as well as by circulating hormones and other neuromodulatory molecules, is far from new and has long been visualized as the mediator of stress-related gastrointestinal symptoms. Interactions between brain and gut extend well beyond the bounds of the stressed, anxious, or depressed gut, and should also encompass situations where the brain, the gut, and their linkage through the autonomic nervous system are affected by the same pathological process as in Parkinson's disease, or PD, those instances where neurological symptoms are a consequence of a primarily gastrointestinal pathology, as in the malabsorption syndromes, and finally to a host of common gastrointestinal symptoms, or syndromes, that reflect dysfunction somewhere along the gut-brain axis, such as irritable bowel syndrome or IBS. Most recently, this axis has been extended to include a new member, the microbiota gut-brain axis, and tantalizing evidence to suggest that bacteria resident in the gut could impact on the, quote, big brain and even contribute to neuropsychiatric disease has emerged. Accordingly, the microbiome has emerged as a potential therapeutic target in disorders as diverse as IBS, PD, and depression. Although many other neuropsychiatric disorders, including Alzheimer's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, autism, stroke, and drug addiction have been linked in one way or another to the microbiome, this review will briefly focus on lessons learned from IBS, PD, and depression, clinical and experimental evidence for a role of the microbiota in disorders of the gut-brain axis. Irritable bowel syndrome. That the microbiota might be a factor in IBS was first suggested by the observation that IBS could develop de novo in the aftermath of acute enteric bacterial, viral, and parasitic infections. More recently, modern sequencing technology has been applied to the study of the fecal and colonic microbiota in IBS in general, and relationships between a variety of clinical and demographic parameters and the microbiota have been investigated. Although data remain limited and not always consistent, it is evident that IBS patients have an altered fecal microbiota relative to healthy individuals. Small intestinal bacteria might also play a role. Although its precise prevalence and role in IBS remain uncertain, evidence has been presented to associate small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, with IBS. Finally, clinical trials have demonstrated that two interventions that modulate the microbiome, an antibiotic and a probiotic, can alleviate IBS symptoms. Quite how either intervention achieves this effect is unclear. Effects on gut-brain signaling, motility, visceral sensation, the gut barrier, and the mucosal and systemic inflammatory responses have been demonstrated, and any one or a combination of these effects could be relevant. Parkinson's disease. Although the role of the microbiota in IBS may relate to its ability to influence somewhere along the gut-brain axis, central perception and modulation of gut events, a much more fundamental involvement of gut bacteria, has been invoked in PD. There is growing evidence, for example, that the pathological process that eventually emerges as classical PD originates in the gut, and that an abnormal microbiome may participate through its stimulation of the innate immune system, thereby leading to misfolding of alpha-synuclein. Roles for Helicobacter pylori infection and SIBO have also been proposed. That the microbiota could exert such a profound impact on the development, morphology, and function of various parts of the central nervous system has been amply demonstrated in experiments in germ-free animals. Depression. Experimental models have revealed the ability of modifications of the microbiota to influence behavior, cognition, mood, and related neurotransmitter function in experimental animals. Given the pro-inflammatory phenotype associated with depression, the aforementioned pro-inflammatory effects of a disrupted microbiome, and the anti-inflammatory actions of some probiotics may be relevant here also. experimental evidence supports this concept. Other routes of influence, including the vagus nerve and microbial metabolites, have also been invoked. Implications for chronic liver disease. Having recognized the clinical relevance of the microbiota gut-liver-brain axis is the pathogenesis of hepatic encephalopathy, or HE, more than 5 decades ago, hepatologists will smile knowingly as they witness the excitement of their gastroenterological colleagues over their recent, quote, discovery of this same axis. Indeed, many of the phenomena invoked in the pathophysiology of HE, SIBO, an abnormal microbiota, impaired gut barrier function, a pro-inflammatory state, and the appearance in the systemic circulation of neuroactive molecules generated by bacterial metabolism will all strike a very familiar note. See Figure 1. This commonality of mechanisms should hasten a more thorough examination of how precisely gut bacteria, whether commensal or unwelcome, can influence cerebral function. From the non-hepatic literature, some generic messages can be gleaned. First, microbiota gut-brain communications are bidirectional, and one must always consider the possibility that changes in the microbiota are secondary. Second, the microbiota may communicate with the brain through several routes: through neuroactive peptides synthesized by bacteria via other bacterial metabolites, for example ammonia, that can impact on the blood-brain barrier or brain function, through inflammatory mediators released locally or in the liver that can mediate neuroinflammation, or along the vagus. Each needs to be considered. With the interesting exception of HE and IBS, where the very same antibiotic, rifaximin, has proven effective and probiotics show promise, revelations on the microbiota gut-brain axis in the laboratory have not, as yet, translated into new diagnostic tools or novel therapeutic approaches. When we reach that stage, the development of clinical trial endpoints will be a challenge. Psychosocial and behavioral endpoints are symptom-driven and thus prone to considerable placebo responses. Objective endpoints are relatively few, and those that have been studied, such as brain imaging, are not widely available and are expensive. Conclusions. It should come as no surprise that studies of the microbiota gut-brain axis in a number of neuropsychiatric disorders have revealed roles for factors that are known to be relevant to HE. A clinical entity that is still the most well-defined clinical illustration of a disordered microbiota gut-liver-brain axis. For more information on clinical liver disease, please visit cldlearning.com. Thank you.